appreciative of everybody to be here. And I'm thinking this is going to be tougher on me than I thought it was going to be. He's got his great grandchildren over here. Old Papa's listening, isn't he?
Yeah.
Well, I'm Marty Durst. I'm John's son-in-law, and we really appreciate everybody here for attending, and it means a lot. Actually, the attendance is much more than what we thought it was going to be. But everybody here means a lot to John and the family. And my family is just appreciative for everybody that is here. For me, my relationship with John started well over 50 years ago. Before Debbie and I married, Deb had some other relationships. She had some other boyfriends. So I was in competition with others from the late 60s to early 70s. And back then, John would come and talk to him, and he says, you know, Marty, he says, I'm rooting for you. And he may have said the same thing to those other guys. I don't know. But I do know that because of that, John was always in my corner. He was always a good man to me, and I've always appreciated it. I did win Little Debbie. And John always, since that time, again, makes me feel that he's always been on my side. He's always been a good man. And Angel, his daughter-in-law, is here, and I know she feels the same way.
Absolutely.
John would also say that at my age, he says, you know, there's not many of us left. And he wasn't wrong. At 90, he saw most of his friends and family pass on before him. Deb does want this to be, and Pastor Al mentioned, he said, we want this to be a celebration of life. And I want to take the next 10 minutes or so and pass on why today we celebrate on behalf of John, a person who really led an incredibly productive life in so many different ways and for so many different people. As a legacy, John was first and foremost, he was a caring giver. He gave to his family, his friends, and his community. And all communities need a guy like John. In Rollins, John was a volunteer fireman for over 25 years. And while John enjoyed the camaraderie and the companionship of the fire department, he really did it mostly because when the fire department was called upon, it was because there was a time of need for someone. There was a fire, there was a medical emergency, or there was an automobile accident. John always gave back. And as you see on the table and things out there, John was also a lifelong member of the the Shriners Club. And then John also went through all the chairs to where he was the potentate for the Southwestern District in 1984. And a goal of the Shrine Club is to fund hospitals to help children with physical illnesses and disabilities. And John worked extremely hard at trying to fund those hospitals for those children. John also served on many community and church boards. He was active as well as professional boards in the construction trades. And until he retired in construction, he was also involved with the Carpenter's Apprentice Program, giving back to those that were following him in the construction industry. And again, John was never the guy that did it for recognition. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. Heck, he even started the first wrestling program back at the Rollins High School back in the early 50s. For some of you here at the ranch, and I don't know how many, I know Nora's one, but he was even the newspaper boy. He delivered papers every morning to about 6 or so ladies at the ranch. You would know, Nora, how many. But he'd get up at 6:15 on the dot, and those of you that know John, and I see buddy Jimmy at the back, but he was first in line at the senior center. He's got to eat first. But if he's got to be at the post office at 6:15, he was there at 6:15, and then go around and deliver newspapers to the different gals on the ranch. And through the years, he was always willing to serve on the military color guard, those folks that showed up for John today. But he thought it was important to attend those funerals for those veterans that passed on prior to him. And we really appreciate those fellows that were here for John today. And they had you gotta quit that.
They passed on very, very nice words about John.
John was extremely proud of his service in the Navy. He did join at age 17 at the end of World War II. And when the World War II ended, he went ahead and joined the Naval Reserves. And then at that point was called back into active service during the Korean conflict, and then served on the USS Iowa. And you saw the model ship of the Iowa back in the back. And John was forever proud of the time that he spent in the service. And he continued to go back to reunions to meet with all his old buddies until he was well into his 80s. And Debbie and I took him back to Los Angeles for the decommissioning of the USS Iowa back in 2012. And he was at his finest when he was able to show his family the boat. They got on early, and so he would take us to where he bunked, where he ate, and down in the guts where he was the machinist on the boat. But he was just as proud as he could be of that boat. And after the service, John worked for a spell on the railroad, where he was also a fireman for a few years on the railroad, and he was also a carpenter. But John was also very, very intelligent, and he wanted more for his family. So while his wife Jean stayed back in Rollins and taught school, and Debbie and Jeff back then were, you gotta quit that. You're gonna make me cry. Yeah, Debbie and Jeff were 12 and 9 at the time, but John pulled a small travel trailer behind him, and he went back to Ames, Iowa, at Iowa State to go back to school to get a degree in construction management. And we still got the piece of paper at the cabin that says he graduated #1 in his class. And so after that, John came back, after graduating, came back to Rollins and went to work for L.M. Olson Construction, where John was a job estimator and a construction superintendent, and he continued to work for Lene and L.M. Olson till he retired in 1990. And John himself was an extremely talented carpenter. We all have furniture that he built for himself, Jeff, Angel, Debbie, and his grandkids. And we were talking today, we've got some friends here and that are good in the construction trade, but John had every tool imaginable. Now, when God said thumbs, I must have said 10, because I don't do well with tools. But these guys, John had all the tools that anyone needed for the trade, but he was also an impulse buyer. So he's not only got every tool, he's got 2 and 3 and 4 of everything. In a work-related accident, John, and you guys up here probably saw it, he cut off half his thumb. So he used to always call himself 4.5, because he had 4.5 fingers. So computer passwords, to get onto the sign-on for the computer is 4.5. And he'd always, when the grandkids were young, of course, John would pull off his thumb. And I will never forget the day when Kevin saw Grandpa pull off his thumb for the first day. Kevin's eyes. And John was also extremely proud of his Swedish heritage. That's on the also. But his dad came over from the old country prior to when John was born. But John always kept in contact with his Swedish relatives. And John, if you didn't know, was able to read, write, and speak Swedish. And some of his most favorable memories were when he and Jean would go back and travel to Sweden to visit all the old relatives. And then they would come over to the States, and John and Jean would then be their guides here in the States. And there's this, if you go back out, you'll see a statue that someone made for him, but the Swedish fellow relatives, they called John the Super Swede, and they made a statue for him. And as with his generation, John was not into hugs and kisses, but his greatest pride was his family. Starting with his parents, his sister Mary and her children, and then he and Jean were married for 55 years before she passed on. But John was one of those guys that always kept in contact with folks, just calling up and making sure everybody was okay. Their 2 children, Debbie and Jeff, were a particular pride. Debbie tells me that she remembers her dad, especially from the standpoint of patience and kindness toward them when they were growing up. Except when Debbie got to the point when she was getting out of high school and she couldn't decide on a career path. Debbie, you're just fickle. Just fickle. Jeff, on the other hand, had some direction. Jeff also was going to go into the construction trade, and Jeff did also go to Iowa State and got an electrical engineering degree and followed John into the construction trades. And that was also a very tough time for John, was Jeff passed on due to pancreatic cancer. And while John remained very, very stoic, he had just lost his best friend and son. John would, without fail, talk about his good life that he had. He grew up in and loved Wyoming and the outdoors. In early adulthood and with his young family, he spent a lot of time camping up in the snowy ranges. He technical climbed around Wyoming and Colorado. You wouldn't think with his physique you could see him with the pin tunes or whatever you do on the mountain, but he climbed. He was an active member and follower of the University of Wyoming athletics. He and Jeannie eventually retired to the Star Valley Ranch in the summer, and then they would go to Mesa, Arizona in the winter, where they were close to Jeff and Angel. And many times through the years, again, John would tell me, he said, I really had a good life. And he did. Mainly because of who he was, a caring, giving man, one that other people just really did think a lot of. And he was a guy that you really did enjoy being around. And some of the special memories that I have of John, and this is more family, but gut busters. When Jeff was young, John would hold his fist out, and Jeff's role was to run into it with his stomach. Point is, you gotta be tough. This is a tough world, so they had gut busters. Well, the next generation, did it follow, Kevin?
Yep.
He'd hold the fist out, and all the grandsons would have to run in, because the grandsons needed to be tough also. He and Jean, and you probably saw it up here as well, all the years that they lived here, but they were extremely graceful dancers. They could really, really dance. And when we go to an occasion, when John took the glasses off, you knew it was time that he and Jean were gonna dance. And once they got out on the floor, I mean, they really did command attention. You just had to watch them go around the floor because they were something special to watch. John also liked to golf. He took it up after he retired, but if any of you guys played golf with him, the score was not important, etiquette was not important, none of that stuff. Speed. How fast can we get around this 18 holes? And there was one time, and there was Dorothy, but her husband Don and John would go out in the afternoon. They'd have two of them in a cart seeing how quick can we get around his golf course. And there was the one time, I think I'm here, and maybe I'm lying, but I'm up here so I can say whatever I want. Don is just getting in the cart. John has a habit of pulling out too quick anyway, and he throws Don out of the cart and rolling down the fairway. No injuries, got around, and he still looked at, okay, 3 hours and 23 minutes. John is another one of those fellows that never, ever met a stranger. He would walk up in a room full of people he didn't know, he would stick out his hand, he would introduce himself, and he would start to talk to you. He was outgoing and friendly, and just always, always cared about other people. Deb and Jeff grew up with the philosophy, you don't have to like everybody, but you do have to be nice to everybody. And then if you don't like them, you can get away from them. But this is something that we hope, this is something from John that gets passed on through the generations. Because the one thing that happened when we lost John is we lost that generation. And now it's up to the rest of us. That we hope that philosophy passes on us, our children, and now their children. Be nice to others. John and Jean were good to their children and their grandchildren. both always will be remembered fondly. And when John got a little bit older and sentimental, he'd leave a family function or he'd hang up the telephone and he'd always say, you know, I just love the hell out of you. Well, John was a special man who lived a special life. John?
We love the hell out of you.
Thank you.